Hello, everyone. This is Chrononauts, a science fiction literature history podcast. I am JM, and I'm here with my regular co-hosts, Nate and Gretchen. It's now the end of August, and things are cooling down nicely. And I'm really happy that we're doing this because I can only speak for myself, but it's been a pretty stressful couple of weeks, and I'm looking forward to talking about some heads, because the heads have it this month on the Chrononauts podcast. So how's everyone doing?
I've been doing good. Just finished up my first week of the semester on campus.
Very nice.
Yeah, I've been doing pretty good as well. Certainly enjoying this break from the heat wave.
Yeah, it's nice. I got the AC off and the windows open for our recording tonight, so I don't expect to start sweating by 9 p.m. So I always turn the air conditioner off because it's kind of annoying and loud.
My apartment here is really good, like temperature-wise. I missed it during the summer. I'm glad to be back here where it's usually really cool and really nice temperature controls here.
Yeah, modern climate control and refrigeration is a good thing typically.
Yes.
Yeah, it makes for pleasant night's sleep, which are very important when you're a student.
Yes.
So I understand you have chosen your thesis topic for the year.
Yes, I have. I am going to write about Deep Space Nine.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm thinking of looking at it through, because I think with Deep Space Nine, one of the big themes is like trauma and like having to cope with that. That's like really big in a lot of the characters' arcs. So that's what I'm planning on writing about for my first thesis, which I will have to repeat again for my master's.
That's really cool. We're all kind of fans of that show here, I think, and Star Trek in general, I guess, but that one in particular, it kind of stands out as being really different and cool and addressing things that none of the other series really do. And maybe they've tried a little bit in some of the newer ones, but I don't really seem to enjoy them as much as good old DS9. So
Yeah, it's definitely my favorite out of the franchise. There's some really bad episodes, but you can just skip those, so that's what makes it nice on rewatch.
Right. That's one of the fun things about old TV, too, is that when there's a bad episode, it doesn't really color the experience of the entire thing, whereas now it's like, you kind of have to watch and keep track of the bad episodes because you miss part of the story if you don't. So.
Yeah.
So before we go any further, I'd just like to run down some things. So again, we are the Chrononauts podcast. You can find us in several different places online. If you go to anchor.fm/chrononauts, you can also find us on Google Podcasts/Play, Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. And we're on YouTube as well. All of our episodes are uploaded there. We have a blogspot at chrononautspodcast.blogspot.com, where you will find various things, including, especially, translations of some of the works that we have and will be doing that have not previously been translated into English or are very difficult to find if they have been. And one of the works that we're going to be discussing today is in fact up there on the blogspot. It's very short. It's called Mr. Vivacious Style, and you can read it up there today. And of course, we're also on Twitter at ChrononautsSF. We have a Facebook. We are a podcast that discusses science fiction literature in all of its forms. We do a little bit of traveling into adjacent areas. We're not really too fussy about genres, but I would say that today we're covering a pretty well-known horror story. And we like to dig up some pretty obscure things sometimes and also discuss some more well-known works. So last time on the podcast, we were talking a lot about brains and heads, and we're continuing that theme today. We have another Russian work that is a really interesting sort of follow-up, in a way, to The Dog's Heart by Mikhail Bulgakov, which we discussed last time. And we also have a couple of other interesting things, as well as something by an author that I've always really appreciated, Olaf Stapledon. And the work we're going to be discussing is Sirius. And I believe Gretchen is going to take us over now, and we'll be talking about The Dog's Head.
Stapledon was born May 10th, 1886 in Cheshire, England. However, he spent his first years of childhood at Port Said because of his father's job. His father worked for the company founded by Olaf's grandfather, William Stapledon and Sons, which supplied ships passing through the Suez Canal with water and coal. Because of this, Stapledon's childhood was quite lonely, his closest friend being a terrier named Rip. His mother was also quite protective of him, something that irritated Stapledon, but her admiration for poet and political critic John Ruskin would inspire Olaf's more socialist views he maintained throughout the rest of his life. Stapledon attended the boarding school Abbotsholme for his elementary education, then went on to get a BA and MA in history at Balliol College in Oxford. Later, he would receive a PhD from the University of Liverpool. After earning his MA, however, Stapledon first got a managerial job in Liverpool through his father, which he had very little enthusiasm for. His next job was at Manchester Grammar School, where he enjoyed teaching history, setting up events in history like plays and having his class act them out. The job lasted a year, as other instructors were annoyed by his teaching style. During both of these jobs, he had also been lecturing at the Workers' Educational Association. His talks on literature, psychology, and industrial history were often imbued with his leftist views, something that, unsurprisingly, his employers weren't too happy with. It is very possible that his political positions and the ease with which he spoke of them played a role in his lifelong inability to gain a permanent academic post. Stapledon's first book was a collection of blank verse poetry, Latter-day Psalms, which was published in 1914. Poetry, though it interested him throughout his life, was something he especially desired to pursue in his youth. His pacifism and anti-war stance appears in the poetry, ideals that would be cemented by his experiences during World War I. During the war, Stapledon served in the Friends Quaker Ambulance Corps, a group formed so Quakers could still help in the war effort without betraying their belief in peace. On July 16, 1919, Stapledon would marry Agnes Zena Miller, a first cousin from Australia. They had spent time in person on several different occasions where Agnes was impressed by Olaf's kind and considerate nature. Their actual engagement and marriage plans were made through correspondence. Soon after the marriage, the couple had 2 children, Mary Sidney Stapledon, born May 31st, 1920, and John David Stapledon, born November 6, 1923. In his biography of Stapledon, Sam Moskowitz paints a pretty nice image of Stapledon's home life. According to him, as Olaf began to work on his novels at home, he and Agnes shared their interests and ideas with each other. Olaf about his writing and manuscripts, Agnes about the local activities she was involved in. Agnes would often proofread Olaf's work, claiming that spelling was not one of his strong suits. Olaf wrote a book for his children, verses for Mary and David, and along with the poetry he wrote, he also included illustrations he made himself. To digress a moment, the cover illustration for the first edition of his novel Oddjohn was also drawn by Stapledon. Unfortunately, I do have to sort of mar this really sweet depiction of his family life by saying that he did, in fact, have 2 extramarital affairs, one with activist Evelyn Gibson and the other with his painting teacher Diana Gurney. Apparently, his affair with the former was partially the inspiration for one aspect of the work that we'll be covering by him tonight.
Yeah, I was going to say there's definitely some issues there that manifest themselves pretty clearly in this novel.
To return to his career, Stapledon continued to give lectures and teach university courses on history and psychology throughout the 1920s, and began writing in academic journals on sociology, psychology, and philosophy during this time. In 1929, he would publish the book A Modern Theory of Ethics. It would be his next book, though, Last and First Men, published a year later, that would secure his legacy and begin his career of writing fiction works, specifically science fiction. It was published by Methuen in Britain and in the US by Cape and Smith, notable for being one of the first publishers of William Faulkner and republishing D.H. Lawrence, Sigmund Freud, and Evelyn Waugh for American readers. This led to Stapledon's novel gaining serious consideration from critics and serious praise. Following the reviews of Last and First Men, Stapledon made the decision to become a writer full-time and a lecturer part-time. With the publication of Star Maker in 1937 came Stapledon's first real contact with the world of science fiction magazines and writers. Although he was not familiar with science fiction magazines, himself not recalling ever picking any up before Star Maker, he did have among his library, or had expressed interest in, David Lindsay's Voyage to Arcturus, Edwin Abbott's Flatland, and the works of Jules Verne, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and of course H.G. Wells, who he exchanged correspondence with. So quite a few names that we have brought up on this podcast. Around the start of the Second World War, Stapledon, with his principles of nonviolence, naively held true to the idea that the invasion of a nation could be resisted without the use of force. As he says in his introduction to Star Maker, you cannot, in cold blood, shoot a whole people. However, after taking in a German Jewish refugee, Wolfgang Bruick, in 1939, and as the crimes of the Third Reich became more clear, he realized the need to resist, with force if necessary, the rise of fascism and Nazism. Besides this instance, however, Stapledon very much held true to his pacifism. In 1949, with tensions between the US and Russia mounting, and the former having a monopoly on nuclear weapons, a cultural and scientific conference for peace endorsed by the latter nation was planned, and among the members who would be at the conference was Stapledon. He was invited because he was the only British figure interested in the event that wasn't refused a visa by the British government. Stapledon was overwhelmed by press as the only British representative, rushed through the conference, and soon after found out he, along with the other celebrities there, were duped when Russia several months later tested out their new nuclear weapons, exposing the conference as a way to stall while they developed their own atom bomb. With this incident, Stapledon officially cut ties with the communist movement, though he still held left-wing views and ideas. Stapledon also showed a growing interest in civil rights later in life, attending and participating in events fighting against segregation in the US, racial inequality in Britain, colonialist rule in India, and apartheid in South Africa. On September 6, 1950, Stapledon would collapse, dying before his family could help him. The cause of death was a coronary arterial occlusion. His legacy lives on in science fiction, going on to inspire the likes of Brian Aldiss, Ursula K. Le Guin, and Theodore Sturgeon. As JM mentioned, the specific work we'll be covering for Olaf Stapledon tonight is Sirius. It was published by Secker and Warburg in 1944, who had previously published one of Stapledon's works of philosophy. Although Methuen had been the publishing company Stapledon worked with for a large majority of his books, they refused to publish Sirius, given the more risque aspects of the plot, which we'll be getting to. Sam Moskowitz writes, concerning Sirius, in terms of storyline and quality of writing, this is not only Stapledon's best work, but one of the greatest masterpieces of science fiction, while Robert Crossley, one of the most prominent Stapledon biographers, claims Sirius is the Stapledon novel I most enjoy rereading. It is brilliantly inventive, as Stapledon at his best always is, but it is his most successful effort at actual storytelling, and while it is often funny, it fully engages the feelings and ultimately is powerfully tragic. As for myself, I agree especially with the comment about its quality of writing. I think Sirius stands out with its style of prose.
So, I really like this book. I enjoyed it a lot. I think that we will get to talking about this eventually, but perhaps the last quarter or so maybe isn't quite as pleasing for a couple of reasons. But in general, I thought this was really powerful work, and it is different from his other stuff in that I've read anyway. There's still quite a few that I haven't read, but it's certainly different from Last and First Men and Star Maker in the sense that, yes, it's much more of a story about individuals rather than some grand cosmic panorama that spans billions of years and millions of light years. I mean, it does have some sort of far-reaching, I think, evolutionary implications and stuff, but it's definitely deliberately handles this on a much smaller scale, and I think it's really interesting to see him do that. There's not a lot of description of people's inner thoughts and so on, although Sirius himself, the character, does get quite a lot of, sort of internalized thought processes and stuff like that. And there's certainly a little bit more dialogue than what you would normally see in his cosmic works.
Still, there's not a great deal. Yeah, I would agree that I like this a fair amount, except, the final arc I wasn't really that into. I think throughout the novel, there's kind of this, resentment of female sexuality almost. He definitely puts a lot of his sexual hang-ups on his sleeve here, probably more so than a lot of the other authors we've read. Certainly more so than the Visiak, maybe on the same lines as the VA, but in a bit of a different way. But I just didn't really like how it kind of came together at the end. But we'll certainly get into it when we do the spoiler summary. But yeah, overall, I think the writing was really good. It brings up some interesting philosophical ideas and ethical concerns, as well as just being an interesting plot to follow. But yeah, not much in the way of dialogue, even though he does confine it to the 1930s, 1940s England and Wales versus this galaxy, all of time spanning work. And I'm certainly curious to read how Last and First Men and Star Maker unfold. I think we have plans to cover both of those on the podcast at some point.
Yeah, there is a first-person narrator, but in general, this does share something in common with the other works that I've read in that the style is a little bit detached. It's a little bit just trying to give you sort of a bare account of what happens. And despite, Nate, what you say about his sexual hang-ups, and I don't know, I may agree, I may not, we'll get to that, but there's definitely something in there that I think we all agree is a little bit problematic. But
yeah, one very specific part that
yeah, exactly.
we can get to.
I think we're all talking about the same thing. Despite that, what impressed me the most, I think, about the style is there's very little judgment to it. It seems very obviously you can sort of tell what sort of viewpoint Stapledon maybe has, but he's not telling you what to feel or what to think. He's telling you about the events, maybe about how Sirius might think about things, because he's actually telling his biographer, which is sort of the framework of the novel.
Right.
But Stapledon himself doesn't overtly pass judgment on anyone, for the most part.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting. It's a little bit detached, and I think it actually kind of works with him. I mean, I wouldn't want all novels to be like this, because there's a certain remoteness, I guess, to him. Even when he's writing about people at a small scale, and you can feel his mind almost wanting to take off into the cosmos. But I think it works. It works really well for him, and I can see why Robert Crossley said that this was the one that some of his students found most appealing, because it does have that personal touch that the cosmic works sort of lack, even though they're towering works of imagination in a lot of ways.
I should say this is the only work so far that I've read by Stapledon, and I can assume that the other works are definitely much more detached, but it does have that feeling in this book as well, to the point where sometimes, like you said, there is the first-person narrator, and when he makes himself clear, he kind of shows up in the narrative sometimes, it's almost like you had forgotten that he was there.
Yeah.
And he usually comes in with, these really more pathologizing sort of passages, which I do kind of want to talk about as well. I didn't really mention them as much in the summary, but he kind of, applies psychology, especially to one of the other characters besides Sirius.
Yeah. It's kind of startling when he makes his interjections, because it's easy to forget that he's even there, kind of. Mm-hmm. And then when he does makes his little psychological assessments, and you're like, I'm not sure.
Yeah, a little questionable sometimes.
But he has a vested interest, which gets revealed later on. Well, pretty much right from the start, as he has a bias that's pretty clear.
Yeah. He's not as detached as you would think.
Right. I mean, he has feelings for one of these characters, and it's not the dog. So he has a personal bias, and I think it does sort of color some of his attitudes. And I mean, it's sort of ambiguous at the end of the book whether things really go well for him or not. But now I think we're starting to get a bit into spoiler territory. But yeah, I'm glad that we did this book. I think that there were certain parts of this book that really made me feel something. Like, they were powerful, also kind of funny at times. It's like I could almost picture this being made into not necessarily a family-oriented movie, but like, it's almost, I mean, of the works that have been optioned for films by Stapledon, it's pretty much this one and Oddjohn, but neither of them have been made. And then somehow, a year or two ago, a film of Last and First Men got made. I have no idea how they pulled that off. I really don't know.
I didn't know about this film.
Yeah,
that's out of all the ones that I would have thought would first get an adaptation, that's not the one that I expected.
Yeah, I can see an adaptation of this working very well. There's certainly some parts of, like, the Welsh countryside that would be neat to see on the screen.
Oh, yeah. And, of course, dogs are always fun to see on film.
Yeah, so. Right.
Yeah. Another dog movie.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of dogs. Well, I think that people should read this. I think that the positives far outweigh any misgivings that certainly I have about the way it all transpires towards the end of the book, maybe. And even then, I must admit, like, the last scene made me a little bit teary-eyed. It was potent.
Yeah, I mean, we'll certainly get to the specifics when we get there, but yeah, I would agree that there's more positives than negatives there, but still, I wish that some of the negatives weren't there to begin with.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I do agree that there are some negatives, but I overall really did enjoy this work and would like to read some more Stapledon in the future. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, Last and First Man especially sounds really cool. And
Star Maker.
Yeah.
Those two, we'll be getting into at least one, if not both of those on the podcast at some point, I think. I would like to do them. They're hugely influential, especially, I think, Star Maker, but both of them really.
Sirius starts with a framing story where the narrator of the novel, known as Robert, speaks initially of his romance with a woman named Plaxi Trelawney, who, after the illness and death of her mother, he can't reach. Concerned with the content of unaddressed letters to him from his lover, Robert tracks her down to a cottage on the outskirts of a Welsh moor and waits for her to return to the house. He soon hears her voice in the distance, but also hears another, one he describes as articulate but inhuman. Soon he sees the owner of that voice as two figures approach him, Plaxi and a large dog. The dog, which Plaxi refers to as Sirius, is wolf-like, seeming to be mostly of the Alsatian breed, and his most distinct feature that sets him apart from the look of other dogs is the size of his head, which is much larger than usual. Sirius speaks, though not in an understandable dialect to Robert, to Plaxi, who understands him and responds, both of them acknowledging Robert and deciding to sit down to a meal with him. As they eat, Plaxi begins to tell Robert of Sirius's history. Robert is convinced not just by the story but by Sirius's behavior, his reactions as Plaxi recounts it, which proves his intelligence and awareness. Robert also senses the very close relationship between the two, accounting for the distance Plaxi has shown him in the past, even feeling jealous when Sirius at one point kisses Plaxi, though he also gains positive feelings for Sirius over the course of their conversation. He is told by Plaxi that Sirius is the result of her father's work on animal intelligence, who Robert knew conducted experiments in that vein. She also gives him numerous documents about Sirius and his development, which, along with Sirius's own account, Robert uses to write about Sirius himself. Thus does the story of Sirius actually begin. Before creating Sirius, Thomas Trelone works on rodents, testing his technique to achieve greater intelligence in other animals. His method consists of injecting a hormone into a mother that increases the bulk of the brain, as well as the number of nerve fibers in it, of unborn young, different from his colleagues, who would just feed the mother the hormone. Struggling with difficulties such as trying to keep the hormone isolated from the mother's own bloodstream, producing healthy offspring injected with the hormone, and prolonging their lives so that they could reach their fuller intellectual potential, Trelone moved from mice, guinea pigs, and rabbits to animals such as cats, monkeys, and dogs. Trelone decides to focus more on the latter, due to their heightened freedom in society and their sociability. He eventually creates a litter of puppies, all except 2 of which die soon after their birth. The 2 who do survive do not live up to the expectations Trelone had for their intelligence, despite being smarter than average dogs. Trelone decides to mix Border Collie and Alsatian for another attempt at his experiment, the first because of its reputation for intelligence, and the second not just because of its intelligence but also its strength. The puppies that result from this new trial are 4 in number, but 1 survives, and this puppy is Sirius. With this success, Thomas has his pregnant wife Elizabeth and their 3 other children move to Wales, where he will visit them when off from his work. A litter of super sheepdogs, dogs that were intelligent but not to the level of awareness Trelone hoped of Sirius, were also brought to Wales and given to their shepherd neighbors to distract from Thomas's more significant work. Meanwhile, Sirius remains a puppy and grows about the same rate as a human infant would. Thomas discusses with Elizabeth many things regarding the development and treatment of Sirius, including the importance of treating Sirius as a social equal to their human children. Although Elizabeth has concerns about the idea of Sirius ever finding a place to fit in, she prepares for the raising of Sirius and Plaxi, her new child, side by side. Even early in his infancy, Sirius's lack of hands is already a disadvantage to him, as Plaxi's dexterity grows, but he is better than her in movement, walking on his 4 legs while Plaxi still has yet to master walking on 2.
Yeah, and the hands thing is kind of an obsession of his, right? It's kind of a constant throughout the book.
Yeah, it comes up a lot.
Yeah, he feels this frustrating lack. He has the intelligence, but there's all these things that humans can accomplish that he can't, simply because he doesn't have a proper hand. So he's always having to come up with all these clever ways of getting around that.
Yes, that's definitely a major thread throughout the book. The 2, Plaxi and Sirius, are extremely close, a bond that will affect them throughout the rest of their lives. They try to attempt anything the other does, though occasionally it is impossible. Plaxi is unable to smell and hear things as keenly as Sirius, but she is able to use her hands and sees better than him. Although Plaxi at first ribs Sirius for his ineptitude with handling items, she eventually realizes that he needs help, and she essentially shares her hands with him, performing for him tasks he is unable to manage himself. Sirius also starts to develop speech alongside Plaxi, but finds it challenging to imitate human speech. He does, though, establish a way of speaking that is equivalent to it, which the family soon learns to understand as well as human spoken English. At one point, Sirius falls ill while still a puppy, but Elizabeth nurses him back to health. This incident, however, makes Plaxi jealous, thinking her mother is favoring Sirius over her. The reverse occurs when Sirius pulls through his illness, as Elizabeth shows attention to Plaxi, and in a fit of envy, Sirius nips Plaxi's leg as she is receiving attention from their mother. After the chaos of the following scene, where the family dog Gellert attacks Sirius and Plaxi and Elizabeth come to his aid, the true extent of the deep bond between Sirius and Plaxi, as well as between them and Elizabeth, is clear. Later, after this incident, Sirius gains respect for Gellert, who he admires for his canine qualities. It is through him Sirius learns of the thrill of hunting, despite his initial humanesque horror at it. However, Plaxy's disgust at the habit, and Sirius's realization that Gellert can't speak and lacks the same awareness he has, places the other dog lower in his estimation than before. When Plaxy and Sirius begin to read and write, Sirius has extreme difficulty with it. While before it had seemed to him that his lack of hands was his only real problem, it now becomes clear that his vision is a challenge as well, as he has trouble distinguishing certain letters from each other. With extensive effort and practice, and a mitten that can hold a pencil or pen made by Elizabeth, his writing improves, though he is not able to achieve Plaxy's level. Plaxy soon starts to attend the village school near them, and Sirius, wishing he could do the same, asks Plaxy to tell him all about her lessons. He also goes on walks with Thomas when the latter is home, who also expands his knowledge of science and history. It is soon that Sirius realizes he is colorblind, as well as having poor sight in general. Discouraged by this, he does feel better when Thomas reminds him of his superior senses of smell and hearing to humans. Not only can he hear and smell things that the rest of the family can't, he can also distinguish and detect their emotions based on these senses, sometimes before the others themselves are conscious of what they're feeling. Sirius also has trouble listening to human music because to him it is still off-pitch. However, the family decides to teach him music, which does give Sirius a better appreciation for it. He starts joining the family in songs and eventually experimenting with music to make it fit more canine tastes.
Yeah, I wish I could hear the Sirius music.
Yeah, I'd like to see what an adaptation would do about that.
Yeah.
They say it's like micro-tuned, which I thought was pretty interesting. Definitely some very avant-garde stuff, which he does more with later. I really like the descriptions of music that are throughout the novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of the baying of dogs.
Right.
Yeah, there's one of my favorite scenes in the whole book involves the music, actually.
Yeah.
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
As an adolescent, Sirius is not as broad as most sheepdogs, nor is he as bold. One particular neighboring dog by the name of Dialdo, I believe is the pronunciation. I forgot to check on this.
I have no idea about Welsh.
I
feel like it's Dialdo, but I'm not sure.
Dialdo? Yeah, I think I'm going to go with that. One particular neighboring dog by the name of Dialdo constantly harasses Sirius, including a time where he only lets up when chased away by Plaxy, prompting her to tell Elizabeth that Sirius hasn't much spunk. After the incident, Sirius begins to train himself, growing stronger in order to confront Dialdo. When the long-anticipated day arrives, Sirius taunts Dialdo into chasing him, outsmarts the other dog, and attacks him, sinking his teeth into the other's neck and refusing to let go. The taste of blood exhilarates Sirius, makes him feel alive, and his family have to pry his teeth out of his opponent, shouting and screaming at him. When he finally releases his grip, the family leaves Sirius to tend to Dialdo, who succumbs to the wounds.
Yeah, this is a really sad part.
Yeah, it's really... And of course, this will be something that kind of occurs throughout the novel. There will be a couple of these incidents, but this one, is the first to really show that what will be known as the wolf moods in him.
Yeah.
But the incident leaves Plaxy horrified, Elizabeth having to explain Sirius's lesser social status in the eyes of the rest of society, and Sirius himself with more courage, as well as knowledge of a more vicious nature within him. Sirius's sexuality, given the lack of modesty imposed on human children, developed strongly in this period of his life. Unfortunately, his affairs never completely satisfy him, for while the physical attraction exists between him and the female dogs he has sex with, he is still aware of having a much more developed intelligence than them, and finds them unattractive after their coupling is done. While not explicitly sexual, Plaxy herself has childhood crushes, particularly on a fellow classmate who she abandons Sirius to spend time with. Plaxy doesn't allow him to go with her to see her friend, Gwen, for fear of the secret of Sirius's true nature being revealed. During her crushes, Plaxy often neglects the company of Sirius and finds it more difficult to connect with him. Later, Plaxy has her first sexual relationship with a Conway Pritchard, and during this period, Plaxy expresses not merely indifference towards Sirius, but hostility. After being cruel to Sirius in front of Conwy at one point, Plaxi tries to make amends and promises that they will always be friends and always come back to each other. When Plaxi reaches the age of 16, Elizabeth suggests to Thomas that she go to boarding school, something he and Plaxi herself are reluctant about. Eventually, she is enrolled, while Thomas makes plans for Sirius to train as a sheepdog. He approaches Sirius about the plans he has for his future to become first a sheepdog, then to work at Cambridge as an animal psychologist. Sirius agrees to these arrangements, though is not quite enthused by them, especially being away from Plaxi. When Plaxi heads off to school, leaving home before Sirius, she hugs him and says she will always belong to him, to which Sirius responds that he also belongs to her. Sirius takes on the role of sheepdog apprentice under a native Welshman named Pew, who Sirius finds from the start to be a good man. As Thomas presents Sirius to him, Pew already has a bit of a feeling that Sirius is a much more intelligent dog, and also decides to nickname Sirius Bran, an easier name to call out while working. Soon he has Sirius and his more experienced sheepdog Idwal out in the valley, showing the former his new trade. During his first day, Sirius is at a loss when Pew includes him in the maneuvers he put Idwal through, especially since he cannot understand the Welsh commands from the human. He is exhausted afterwards from the work. However, he eventually starts to get the hang of it. Pew gives him, as well as Idwal, a good amount of independence while tending to the sheep. The dogs have to make sure the sheep remain unharmed and have specific barks to alert Pew to any emergencies that arise. Pew himself grows more certain that Sirius's intelligence is more on a human's level, after several incidents indicate this to be the case. At one point, Sirius has the strong desire to write Plaxi. He takes a pencil, paper, and envelope, as well as borrows a sheet of stamps. With much effort, he writes his letter, then manages to place the stamps on the envelope, mangling the sheet a bit.
Yeah, I really like this part as well.
Yeah, I like seeing that process that he goes through to do this.
And we haven't got here quite yet, but rather than interrupt again, I'll just say I love the way this chapter ends.
Once finished, he puts the stamps and the rest of the materials where he found them, and brings the letter to the mailbox. Later, Pew hears about Sirius taking the letter, obviously not one he had asked to deliver, and finds the damaged stamp sheet and tooth marks in the pencil, adding to his suspicions. With the arrival of Plaxi's holiday from boarding school, Sirius is brought home to be with the Trelawney family. Thomas hears Pew's assessment of Sirius as a sheepdog, including his habit of being a daydreamer, and asks Sirius about his experience. Sirius is not satisfied with the lifestyle, yearning for more knowledge, envious of Plaxi's ability to attend school. He hopes to learn more from Plaxi when they reunite, that she will tell him of what she learned, but finds that she isn't interested in discussing that part of her school experience. There is also a change between the two of them. They find it more difficult to connect with each other than before their separation, to show affection as they used to. Further alienating them is Plaxi's deeper interest in art, drawing and painting, things that Sirius cannot grasp or appreciate as fully with his poor eyesight and colorblindness. On his end, Sirius sometimes finds the scent of Plaxi and humans in general repulsive. When Plaxi heads back to school, he feels almost relieved. The winter of Sirius's apprenticeship under Pew is bitter and dangerous, with the amount of snow a threat to sheep, dogs, and even men. The atmosphere often leaves Sirius in a pensive mood, and I think I will read an excerpt here just because I really enjoy this passage, and I think it highlights the writing pretty well.
Oh, I think I know what passage you mean.
Yeah, I feel like this one is really good. Sometimes, when Sirius was out in the hills alone in the winter dawn, examining the condition of the snow and looking for sheep in distress, the desolation of the scene would strike him with a shivering dread of existence. The universal carpet of snow, the mist of drifting flakes, the miserable dark sheep pawing for food, the frozen breath on his own jaws, combined to make him feel that, after all, this was what the world was really like. That the warm fireside and friendly talk at Garth were just a rare accident, or perhaps merely a dream. The whole world is just a dreary accident, with a few nice accidents mixed up in the mass. He had still to learn that there was something far worse than bitter weather, with the near prospect of food and comfort, far worse even than his bitter loneliness at Caer Bly, and that the most horrible things in the world were all man-made. It was perhaps well that he did not yet realize the depth of man's folly and heartlessness, for if he had done so, he might have been turned against the dominant species forever. As it was, he attributed all evil to accident or fate, and in fate's very indifference he sometimes found a certain exhilaration. Plodding home through the snow one day, so he told me long afterwards, he had a kind of inner vision of all living things, led by man, crusading gallantly against indifferent or hostile fate, doomed in the end to absolute defeat, but learning to exult in the battle and snatching much delight before the end. And he saw himself as a rather lonely outpost in this great war, in which victory was impossible, and the only recompense was the sheer joy of the struggle. But by the very next day, so he said, his mood had changed from self-dramatization to an amused acceptance of his littleness and impotence. So I just wanted to read that one.
That's so funny. I would have, if you hadn't done that, I would have probably figured out a way to read that in the end of there, before the end of that same passage.
I really do like those pastoral musings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that part just was really striking. I really liked that one. That part really stuck with me after I read it.
Yeah, there's definitely some moments and passages in this book that I think will probably stay with me forever. Like, there's something about it, even though, yeah, it's not a perfect novel, but there's just the way it conveys certain feelings of isolation and kind of being a person without a feeling of community, without trying to reach for some kind of spiritual greatness. It's really potent, I think.
Yeah, and it is a very moody novel overall. I mean, Sirius's motions it's almost like a roller coaster with him. Like, it goes back and forth to what he's feeling, and sometimes it's really intense, and yeah, he does it well.
Yeah, those passages where it's just like those musings are always really interesting to read. But during his next break, Sirius reads poetry, including the works of Browning, and delves further into music, despite human music being quite frustrating for him. His relationship with Plaxi continues to be more remote than it used to be, and their seemingly incompatible interests cause them frustration. However, they both are still united by an interest in what they refer to as spirit, something that science doesn't approach and can't seem to identify or explain. Sirius especially is concerned with this, feeling worried about his future and what his purpose is. He approaches Thomas about it, getting confirmation from the latter that he is a person, not just an experiment. Sirius then questions the decisions Thomas has made for him about what he should be doing with his life, and asks why Thomas would create him without making a world he could live in. In response, Thomas promises to do what is best for Sirius. Returning to complete his year with Pew, it is arranged for Sirius to have working hours like a human, which Pew, now basically in the know about him, agrees to. He gives Sirius more independence and responsibilities while working. Although Sirius looks forward to the end of his time as sheepdog, he still has grown to be quite interested in his labor and enjoys working under Pew. However, he also feels a deeper conflict regarding his position in the world in relation to man. Just as with his feelings for Plaxi, Sirius's feelings towards all of humanity occasionally swing radically from affection to resentment. He refers to the state of resentment he sometimes finds himself in as his wolf nature or wolf mood, expressing it through isolating himself from humans, ridding himself of their scent and hunting. At one point, Sirius's wolf mood causes him to attack another shepherd's ram, killing it the same way he killed Dialdu, then eating a part of it. He is never found out for this crime, which he atones for by treating Pew's herd with extreme gentleness for the rest of his time with him. Once back home, Sirius's wolf mood grows stronger, no longer distracted by the work he had while a sheepdog. This is exacerbated by Plaxi's attitude towards him, which is more distant than it has ever been. When asked about it, she eventually responds that Sirius wouldn't understand why she is upset, that it is a human thing. The words hurt Sirius and trigger another wolf mood incident. He fails to return home for a number of days, so the family organizes a search party. Plaxi finds him tearing at the flesh of the corpse of a pony he's killed. In his state, Sirius doesn't recognize her, but she is able to snap him out of it. The family is able to cover up Sirius's actions. The incident causes Thomas to realize the strain Sirius is under, and Plaxi and Sirius to reconcile and confide in each other. After more discussion with Sirius and Elizabeth, Thomas decides the former will still go to the Cambridge laboratory, but will also be shown more of Cambridge by the latter. On the outside, Sirius must still act like a regular dog. The importance of this rule is made clear when people attempt to kidnap Sirius, but he is able to fend them off and get help from Thomas. Initially, Sirius enjoys Cambridge, fascinated by the activity and culture to be found in the city and university. Thomas introduces Sirius to a select group of academic colleagues, having dinner parties where he presents Sirius to the guests. At the laboratory, Sirius is often a subject of research, which he cooperates in with interest. He also begins his own book, studying the social behavior of dogs, and plans to write an autobiographical work once the first book is finished. Both works are never completed, our narrator Robert informs us. His Cambridge life, with the constant spotlight it puts on him, leads to a bit of a bloated ego and complacency in Sirius. When he returns to Wales after the first term at Cambridge, he also realizes how physically out of shape he is. During his second term at Cambridge, Sirius is less happy and more restless. His attitude is more self-centered than before. Sirius, uneasy about the changes he's gone through, wants to return to Pew for a break from Cambridge, but Thomas argues he isn't in good enough shape and needs intense physical training. The plan falls through and he remains at Cambridge. Sirius's emotional state spirals as he struggles with his Cambridge lifestyle. The turning point to this state comes when, after shutting himself in his room for several hours, he has an extreme sensory experience that Sirius interprets as a mystical vision. After this event, Sirius becomes more fascinated by religion and wishes to have a conversation with a religious person. Thomas, however, has no religious people among his colleagues, so he and Elizabeth arrange for Sirius to meet with a cousin of the latter, a Reverend Geoffrey Adams. Geoffrey lives in London and has a parish in a poor part of the city where he conducts a lot of humanitarian work. On the way to visit the Reverend, Sirius sees for the first time the fullest extent of the oppressive, miserable conditions impoverished humans live in. He soon reaches Geoffrey's residence, who learns quickly to treat Sirius like a human being. After their first discussion, Sirius, whose time with Geoffrey is only supposed to be a few days, asks to stay with the Reverend longer and experience this new type of life. The Reverend agrees, interested in the dog's interest in spiritual matters and in music. For his time with Geoffrey, Sirius masquerades as his dog and is allowed into people's spaces through this explanation. Once, Sirius and Geoffrey come upon dockers on strike, attacking black-legged workers, people paid to replace them. Geoffrey, though on the strikers' side, protects a blackleg, since he is one of God's creatures. The police then arrive and beat the dockers on strike. This is one of the many instances that causes Sirius to marvel at the differences between this environment compared to the others he is used to, and between men in general. Country people, intellectuals, dockers. Mentally, they were far more alien to one another than dogs, cats, and horses. Sirius also resolves during his stay with the Reverend that he will spend his time in the country, the same environment he grew up in. Before he leaves Geoffrey, Sirius wants to attend at least one of his services. The Reverend, knowing of Sirius's talent for music, decides he will have Sirius attend and sing at a Sunday service from behind the door of the vestry. When the day arrives and Sirius sings for the congregation, rumors spread of the performance, leading to an increase in attendance, with many curious about this secret singer.
Yeah, I really like this too.
Yeah.
This is a good scene. I really like this bit.
This whole Geoffrey part was definitely one of my favorite sections in the book too.
Yeah, I really like this part. Sirius puts on 2 final performances the last Sunday of his time with Geoffrey, actually presenting himself to the crowd during the ending service. After his departure back to Cambridge, Sirius and Geoffrey exchange letters, in which the latter mentions the presence of more people and journalists curious about the canine performer. Soon after, with the year being 1939, war breaks out. At this time, Sirius is a sheepdog for another farmer by the name of Thwaites. Thwaites is a harsh and violent man, cruelly punishing his dogs for little to no reason. Thwaites especially shows hatred towards Sirius, who he suspects is different from other dogs, and realizes does not cringe or flinch before him as other ones do. After facing brutal treatment by Thwaites, the final straw is the master harming his own dog, Roy, which causes Sirius to snap and attack him. Sirius ends up killing Thwaites, and, in a panic, runs off into the wild to hide. He eventually emerges when he realizes Thomas is coming to see him and confesses what he did to the man. Thomas is able to cover up what Sirius did and get him off the hook.
Yeah, he's pretty good at covering up Sirius's murders, isn't he?
Yeah, they've had to do it a couple of times.
Well, I guess for a pony and a ram, it doesn't really attract the police attention that a person would, and he gets pretty graphic about how he kills him by crushing his windpipe, and he really does some damage to him.
Mm-hmm. And it's always the same way, through the neck.
Yeah, right.
After this, with the conclusion of another winter vacation, Sirius asserts that he will not go back to Cambridge, and that while he has an interest in continuing his skill with sheep, he refuses to be a mere sheepdog, especially after his experience with Thwaites. Thomas then organizes a role for Sirius as partner to Pew, who is finding it more difficult to run the farm as he ages. Now fully aware of the extent of Sirius's ability, Pew helps him learn how to manage the farm financially. Eventually, Sirius also takes on training new dogs to help with the sheep. Elizabeth works at the farm as well, developing a friendly, bantering relationship with Pew. Unfortunately, the war continues to wage and starts to impact their lives more. Thomas and the laboratory are losing funding due to the war, so they put efforts into training dogs to be message carriers for the army. Plaxi, interested in leftist politics, has debates with Sirius about their views. During their conversations, Plaxi also reveals having a lover she is considering marrying, and Sirius tells her about what happened between him and Thwaites, which he had not told her before. The war affects them further as the Trelones receive news of Geoffrey's death through one of the bombings on London, which especially impacts Sirius. For several days after his death, he believes he feels the Reverend's spirit near him. Soon, another raid begins while Sirius and Thomas are in the affected area. Thomas gets partially buried in debris and tells Sirius to leave him behind and find shelter. Sirius refuses, trying instead to get help, but returns to find another bomb has destroyed where Thomas had been. Through grief and shock, Sirius finds his way home and brings the news of Thomas's death. After Thomas's death, Elizabeth, in her grief, becomes obsessed with helping Sirius, showing him a level of affection she had never displayed before. She starts to show interest in helping with the actual management of the farm, which Sirius is displeased by, since it is through this that he has begun to acclimate the local people to his presence. Soon, Elizabeth falls ill and is told by doctors that she is overstraining her heart. Although it isn't serious, that all she needs is rest, she refuses to do so, returning to her jobs on the farm. Unable to keep an eye on her by himself, Sirius summons Plaxi to the farm to help. The task draws the two together closer than they've been in a long time. Unfortunately, while Elizabeth recovers slightly, an incident where she believes one of her sons is dead, seeing a newspaper claiming the destruction of the ship he was serving on, causes her to die from shock and strain, even though it is revealed too late that he survived. In the aftermath of Elizabeth's death, Plaxi and Sirius have to take care of family affairs, such as selling their family house, which, along with its shared grief, bring the two even closer. Although Plaxi is supposed to leave Sirius once everything is wrapped up, she ends up staying with him, the two renting a cottage on Pew's land. Thus, she and Sirius live and work together on the farm. Unfortunately, their happiness doesn't last as a number of locals take issue to her living with the man-dog. As a visit by a local reverend makes clear, people think of the relationship between them as unnatural, and some even think Sirius is a creation of or possessed by evil forces. The reverend, not assuaged by Plaxi's dismissive attitude towards his concerns, further turns their neighbors against them. While Plaxi occasionally grows concerned over her alienation from these humans, she and Sirius continue to live together and to further their relationship. A more delicate way of saying their relationship becomes a sexual one.
Yeah, I really did not like that it took it there. And it was like hinting that it was going there through like a lot of the book, I guess more
Mm-hmm.
kind of subtly when it starts out, and then a little more later on. But yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
really did not like them taking it here.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should wait to talk about it, but I thought it was interesting. I mean, it's definitely uncomfortable on a few levels, but at the same time, yeah, we'll wait till we finish the summary to bring it up, because I think it's going to be a pretty long discussion.
I also would like to mention this is the part that was inspired by Olaf's affair with the activist Evelyn Gibson. That he wrote it as like their forbidden love affair sort of thing, which is kind of reminds me a bit of Hinton, which is a little kind of ruins it a bit for me.
There's one thing that Plaxi says, I don't know if it's around here or a little later, that's just like a really gross line, and I was just like, when I read it.
What is it?
I didn't write it down. She says something like, treat me like I'm your bitch or something like that, and it's...
she does say that.
Yeah.
But I think that, I mean, it's... I don't know. It's weird because, like, we're supposed to think of Sirius as a thinking, intelligent creature, right?
Yeah.
And we do. Now, the thing is, like, I don't know. Let's look at, like, a lot of science fiction of the future from this book. And there's this whole thing about interspecies romance kind of thing. And it's like, yeah, some people like it. Some people probably get squeamish about it or whatever. But, I mean, you also never forget that Sirius is a dog.
No.
But that's the thing, right? Like, the reason why we're uncomfortable with the idea of a human-dog romance isn't that it's a dog so much. It's that the dog is not experiencing the same level of awareness as a person. And not to say that it's necessarily a lesser creature, but that it doesn't, it doesn't feel things in the same way that humans do, whereas Sirius does. So I think that kind of does actually, when you really think about it, it does take away some of the discomfiture of that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it does take away the consent issues that, like, real world, I don't want to call them relationships.
I know. It's just like we're so used to. You're right.
Yeah.
I think that it really helps, though, if you think about this in terms of future science fiction.
Yeah.
And what develops, and what people are willing to be okay with, maybe under certain circumstances. Right?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a huge strain in science fiction of monster romances and romances with extraterrestrials and things like that I guess do start around this time, because I mean, this is kind of fairly early on for that kind of thing. The 44 this was published, something like that?
Yeah, 1944.
I don't know how much of that you see beforehand. There was that one novel that Griffith wrote that's like a romance in space or something like that, but I think there were just like two people that are going on like a pleasure tour or something like that.
Yeah, I'm thinking especially of the interspecies thing.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And that is the aspect that I mean, some people would be uncomfortable with that in general, but then, you have to question, well, why, right? Like, why are you afraid of that? But at the same time, here we have this added complexity that it's actually a familiar creature, not an alien from another planet. Right. It's a dog.
Yeah.
Right? So we're kind of like, our brains are rebelling against it because of that, I think.
Yeah. I had conflicting feelings with it. Like, I kind of felt it at the end sort of neutral about it. Like, it's like, I guess this happens. Because I get that it's like, you are supposed to view Sirius with human intelligence, and that's sort of, it does feel like one of those, like you said, like an interspecies romance in another science fiction piece of media. But I do feel like learning the bit about it being a reference to, like, the forbidden love that he felt towards a woman he was having an affair with, that's actually the part that kind of made me less into it than it being a dog. Just because it felt to me like the Hinton thing. It kind of gave me a feeling of that.
The way he's framing it, yeah, right.
Yeah, so there's so many layers of complexity in this situation.
Yeah.
And several different things that can make you uncomfortable, but that can also kind of make you think, well, maybe not. Maybe I can see why this would happen, and maybe it's kind of okay. I mean, like, there's the whole semi-incestuous angle to the whole thing, and then there's like, yeah, but they're not even the same species, right? Like, can we really say that that's... It's really interesting that he decided to tackle all these things together. Yeah.
It's a very complex situation.
Yeah.
But eventually, Robert arrives. The point in Robert's narrative that is the framing of Sirius's story. Upon finding out the true nature of Plaxe's relationship with Sirius, he plans to gradually wean her from the life she is living, though he doesn't want to cut Plaxe off from Sirius entirely. Although jealous of Robert, Sirius encourages him and welcomes Robert into his home for his stay. At one point, Robert and Plaxe do sleep together, but thoughts of Sirius remain between them. Despite this, the three get along rather well together. After this first visit, Robert sees the two quite frequently on weekends over the following months. The hostility of the local people towards the couple grows. Plaxe ends up having to leave Sirius with the Pews when she is conscripted to do her part for the war effort. Left on his own, Sirius faces another event that increases the hatred towards him. The worker that replaces Plaxe, a Mary Griffith, attempts to seduce Sirius, for she desires a lover, but when he refuses her, she claims that Sirius assaulted her. So this is the part that I was referring to at the beginning about kind of the the really weird bit that I don't really like that much.
Yeah, it's a really tired trope of the false accusation of sexual assault that, I don't know, it just never works. And
So here's my feelings about it are that if you're going to go and do this kind of thing, which, all right, I guess fair enough. But if you're going to go and do that kind of thing, make it mean something. Like, it just feels so throwaway mean-spirited, just kind of like, I mean, I can, you can be like something that he does rather well. And I'll get to that when we talk about our thoughts afterwards. But he makes you kind of see the characters in your head, even though you're not really getting too much about them. You're not really getting their thought processes or even much about their appearance or anything like that. But, I could picture most of them, but that he didn't really put any, there was no, and I'm not saying that he should have, like, maybe he just shouldn't have gone there, because if he had given us this whole backstory about this person and how she was, like, that troubled of an individual, right? Like, it would have really distracted from the main line of the book, and it would have been sort of unwelcome anyway, but at least it would have been, okay, I guess I understand why this happened.
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a MacGuffin plot point. I mean, they could easily have found some other way to make the villagers pissed off at Sirius.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of other...
And, I mean, they do later on, like, there is another final straw in, like, a man being attacked by Sirius. Well, in self-defense, he attacks him. I'll get to that, but that, like, it could have just been that. We didn't need to have this moment.
You didn't need to have that, you're right.
And it kind of, what it reminded me of when I was first reading it and thinking about kind of how unnecessary it was, it feels like that part in Dog's Heart when Sharek has that one part with the affair with that woman, and, like, we didn't need that. Because it's like, if you want to convince us that he's terrible, you've already kind of done that, and it's like, it feels like you've already made a good point, you don't have to include this.
Yeah.
So, it feels unnecessary.
If you're going to include it, it should be significant. It should mean something. But, like, Olaf Stapledon's not interested in her. Like, he's not interested in telling us about her, why she thinks the way she does or anything.
Yeah, she just serves as a plot point. Yeah, so after that, once the story is spread throughout the village, people begin to threaten Sirius and get more violent. The final straw is when a man attempts to shoot Sirius, and Sirius defends himself by ripping at the shooter's leg. The man tells his version of events quite differently, claiming Sirius needlessly attacked him. A few weeks later, Plaxe gets an urgent message from Pew. She arrives after getting leave from duty to find out that Sirius has vanished, and that killed and partially eaten sheep have been found that most likely were his doing. Plaxe goes out to look for him, hoping to find him before local search parties do. When a man who promised to kill Sirius is found dead, the authorities, who had been planning on taking Sirius alive, now want him destroyed when discovered. Plaxi tries again to find Sirius and finally comes across him in a wolf mood. He doesn't recognize her until she breaks down crying. She hides with him, intending to sneak him past the villagers with the help of people from Cambridge. Before the plan can be put into action, though, he is found and shot. Plaxi stays with him, since he knows he won't last much longer. Before he dies, he tells Plaxi, "Plaxi, Sirius, worthwhile." In her grief, Plaxi sings a song Sirius had created, human and canine in style, a song that encapsulates his being and his life, and thus ends the story of Sirius.
With the sun setting on the whole scene.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That last scene is a really good scene.
It is, yeah.
It's very poignant and definitely very sudden and very... He knew that he was going to leave you feeling emotional, and he just didn't, like... There's no attempt to placate anyone at the end of the book. This is just something that Stapledon does. He makes you feel really interested in the scenarios and makes you sort of envision how they play out, even though he doesn't tell you. He doesn't tell you about the dialogues and the conversations unless they're very important. Mm-hmm. I kind of thought, oh, what about Robert and Plaxi? You know, like, we don't know what their future is like. And in the beginning of the book, even like one of the first things Robert says is that they have a pretty stormy relationship, and it's not... It's on again, off again, kind of like, and I kind of wonder, is it going to get any better? I don't really know that it does, you know, like, he doesn't tell us. Yeah. He's literally not interested in it, which is, it's sort of funny that he makes Robert the narrator of the book, because...
It's a weird framing, I think.
Yeah.
Like, in the book's action, he shows up in the story just, like, kind of out of nowhere, it seems. It's just like, okay, he's there now, and there's, like, weird... sitcom-style love triangle. It's like, what's going on here?
Yeah. You know, you have maybe like a fifth of the book left, and all of a sudden he's there.
Yeah. But he doesn't go into any of that. Like, he kind of leaves you to imagine it.
Yeah.
He kind of talks about it a little bit, and yeah, I mean, he doesn't say, notably, that he and Plaxi now have this loving husband-wife relationship. And I kind of... Because it's Plaxi Sirius throughout, and because even he's noting that early on, people are almost saying Plaxi is not entirely human. Yeah, it kind of makes me think, like, he's kind of the dupe in this book, right? Like, he just sort of, he's the biographer of his rival, and I don't know how much of an impact he's really going to have on her and her future, and so on, because Stapledon doesn't tell us.
I can't remember if in one of the interjections when he's kind of... Because the character that he will occasionally jump into the narrative to talk about is Plaxi. And I can't remember if there's any, like, implication that their relationship is ongoing as he's writing this, like, what the state of their relationship is. I think he does mention something about, like, talking to her about this, and she's just kind of... And she is kind of also sick of him pathologizing her and saying, like, it's not that deep to think about it like this.
I think it might be at the halfway point, or perhaps a little less, that he just kind of lets it drop that they're married now.
Yeah.
But he doesn't comment on anything else. Like, he doesn't talk about their relationship at all. He just says, yes, we're married now.
Yeah.
And it's interesting.
Maybe the book's a result of couples therapy or marriage counseling.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Working out his feelings.
Yeah.
In this biography.
I really like the way I don't know. So there are so many ways that I resonated with this. As somebody who was raised with a sister who's around the same, not too far in age from me, maybe not as close as Plaxi and Sirius. My relationship with my sister is not really like, in any way, like what's depicted in this book, in terms of we're not actually very close, so we don't talk all that much, but certainly the childhood experiences resonated. So that's pretty basic, but we also get, the stormy adolescence, not really being sure where to fit in.
Yeah.
All that magnified by the fact that you don't really feel like you belong to any community or any place that's other people just sort of fall into. And I think that especially people who, are maybe a minority on some level among the human race would have an easy time sort of relating to Sirius and relating to a lot of the thoughts that he has in this book. And there was just there's so much in here that made me think, I get what he's going through and I get why he feels that way. So Stapledon really shows awareness of the human conventions, I guess, being an upper middle class British person and everything. But he also really expresses how temporary and not always meaningful they are in nature. And I really appreciated that as well. And of course, there's a really obvious connection with Frankenstein in this.
Yes.
Which is probably something we're going to come back to throughout the podcast, and we already have.
Yeah, and I think specifically this cluster of stories we've been doing, these 2 episodes, have a lot of stories that I wouldn't say necessarily are 100% derived from Frankenstein, but have a lot of obvious similarities of this creature being created that's unique in the world and doesn't really fit into any aspect of society. I mean, we have that here, we have that in Dog's Heart. We're going to have that coming up later in a couple of stories, but
I think this was the closest to the actual ethics of Frankenstein being a creator of a life, and have a soul life that doesn't even have a companion and doesn't have being able to relate to other intelligent beings. It's difficult enough for most people to begin with, but when there's literally no one like you in the world, how hard can it be, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, an interesting thing about this book is that it's almost as if this were Frankenstein and his creation, as if the monster were brought up in a healthy domestic environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Sirius never turns into a monster like Frankenstein's creature does. I mean, while Frankenstein's creature is wronged by the world and he doesn't have anywhere where he could go to or anybody like him to socialize with, at the same time, he also does murder children, which Sirius just doesn't do. He kills people and, well, maybe
in self-defense.
Yeah, exactly. And
he does it for revenge because his dad is like the biggest deadbeat in creation, basically.
Yeah.
And I think, also, like, Sirius never completely, fully, like, turns on humanity.
No.
Where, like, Frankenstein's creature, he does basically forsake humanity. He wants vengeance on all of humanity. And that's not Sirius's case. Even with his wolf moods, he snaps out of them, especially with Plaxi. He still has a connection to humanity.
And I think that's interesting because there's like that running commentary on human nature throughout the entire novel. And he kind of frames it in this like urban-rural divide. When he's on the Welsh moors, he's more prone to being in tune with his wolf nature versus when he's at Cambridge or doing whatever in London. We get more of these passages on his commentaries on his philosophy on communism and the order of social change and like things like that.
You especially get that with the scene with, like, the strike.
Right, exactly.
You especially, like, it leaps out both Stapledon's view of, like, labor and also, his pacifism right in that scene.
Yeah, and Stapledon definitely does reveal some of his political leanings pretty openly.
Yeah.
Much to my surprise, the book actually brings up blacklegging, which, like, at first I thought it was probably racial, but then I kind of looked it up a little more, and then there's some kind of debate about that, and it's like has to do with the coal miners and how the unions would go on strike, and then the company would hire these temporary workers who were like really desperate and really needed work, and they would bring these people in, and of course the regular workers hated them and wanted them dead, because they're like, you guys are betraying, they're like, this company is treating us horribly and you guys are betraying us. And in America, especially in like the Virginia coal mining stuff of the late 1800s and early 1900s and stuff, a lot of the time they would bring in black people, and just like a very, very bad situation all around. And
yeah, one of the non-podcast books I read this time was, I finished up North and South, and there's a lot of that same kind of workers' rights, strikers talk in there, and in that book they bring in the Irish to undercut the striking workers, and it's very much the same kind of thing. And I finished it around the same time as Sirius, so I thought it was kind of interesting companion pieces to one another.
Yeah.
Another thing, when talking about, we kind of got off on, because there's so many different things to talk about.
So many facets.
Yeah. But I wanted to get back a little bit to Thomas and Sirius' relationship with Thomas. What do we really think of that? I don't know about you guys, but I think that it was the death of Thomas that made this book less pleasing to read. Everything after that was sort of sad and not that great for anybody, and sort of like the downness really crept in after that.
Yeah, I feel like that is kind of the turning point in like the mood. It was always like a very pensive book, but that's when you get into like things kind of go downhill from there.
Yeah,
he is very much a benevolent father figure, and
it's really interesting though, because he's like he's called unimaginative in the book, and he obviously, like, he's kind of frustrating as a father, because and he's talking with Sirius about going to Cambridge, and like eventually he's like, well, I do what I can, right? But at first he's like, he doesn't really understand why Sirius wouldn't be happy. He's like, well, we'll just go to the lab and you'll be there and you can talk to all my academic friends and it'll be good, right? Like, it's like, no, that's
what you want to do, right?
Yeah, Thomas doesn't really understand his wolf mood, which I thought was another interesting facet of the novel, and how it relates to our understanding of dog behavior and wolf behavior, and how that's changed over time. So again, this was published in the mid-1940s, which was several decades before the, I guess, very famously known theory on alpha pack behavior, which was written in the 70s and has since been totally discredited.
Yes, debunked
by its own author, but somehow still persist in how some people perceive of pack behavior and wolf behavior and how that relates to dogs to this day. So this was published several decades before that.
So what is that?
It's basically the idea that each wolf pack in the wild naturally has one alpha wolf that is like the leader of the pack, and that leader will naturally form through whatever social cues and dominance, and there's always one alpha in the pack, and males will fight to gain that status or whatever, and it's just apparently total nonsense.
Interesting.
And it's still used now for people trying to, men trying to pick up women.
Yeah, exactly.
With alpha males and beta males.
Right, that's where that whole terminology comes from.
Right. So that whole mentality definitely persists now. And so this brings me to, something else I was going to ask you, Nate, as I think that you're the only one of the three of us that is a regular dog owner, right?
Yeah, so my wife also worked in animal welfare, particularly veterinary medicine and animal behavior, for several years. So while I'm not a personal expert in the area, I've at least been exposed to enough of it around me to kind of have an idea of where the current research and field is. And the basic, I guess, consensus now is that dogs and wolves, while they initially were the same thing, however many tens of thousands of years ago, in the present day are not the same thing. And Stapledon, of course, have no way of knowing this with 1940s animal behavior information, but he vastly overstates the similarity between how a wolf would behave and how a dog would behave.
Yeah, even Sirius even calls, when he slips into his kind of like wild personality, he calls it the wolf mood.
Yeah, exactly, right.
So, yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting kind of from a historical standpoint and his commentary. on that, of what he perceives animals to be thinking from a more natural, instinctual point of view. Because at the end of the day, Sirius still is a dog, despite the fact that he has heightened intelligence and all that, I guess, through a physically much larger brain. It's an interesting angle of the book.
Another thing I did want to bring up with Thomas is there's that one part, so Sirius, when he is with Thwaites, Robert himself jumps into the narrative to basically call out Thomas for, like, this decision to put him under the control of Thwaites. Yeah. Kind of like, how could he be so oblivious to that behavior? Which I think really proves, like, Thomas is well-meaning and really does want to provide the best for Sirius, but he just looks at it in, like, too much of a narrow lens.
Yeah, I think he sums it up in that one thing perfectly, is that Thomas is a nice person. He wants to look after Sirius. He wants the best for Sirius. But I think he sums it up by saying that he's just not imaginative. He can't really conceive of the problems that Sirius will have and how difficult it is for him to both adjust and fit anywhere. And I think that Stapledon does a really cool thing in making Thomas a very sympathetic person in a way, even though he is the, quote, mad scientist, quote, that created this thing. And it's like Sirius even turns to him once and is like, why did you create me without creating any more and without creating a world for me to live in? It's going to be really lonely being me. And it when you think about it in terms of a human being, yeah, it sounds like an angsty, mopey teenager talking, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, it's real. That's actually what he's going through, and what he's always going to go through. It's not really going to get better, and that's why, Sirius has this thing where he gets fascinated with religion for a while, and he wants to find answers, and he's telling Thomas, he's like, well, that's fine. Oh, that's good, but one thing's for sure, the spirit is really important, and he's like being defiant and stuff. And Thomas is like the perfect straight-laced materialist, and he doesn't really understand any of that. And he's like, oh, you're just getting, like, Plaxy's been talking to you too much or something. You're getting, like, carried away with this nonsense about the spirit and the soul and all that. And, like, doesn't mean anything. And he kind of, like, when Sirius gets into various things, he kind of, like, poo-poos it, kind of, like, he's your well-meaning but sort of obtuse dad figure, basically, throughout.
Excuse me. He's certainly not neglectful like Dr. Frankenstein.
No.
He at least tries to educate and give Sirius an experience as far as what he thinks would be the best for him. Even though I guess at the end of the day, nobody really does understand Sirius and can relate to him on any meaningful level. Even somebody like Plaxy, who has been close to him his entire life.
Yeah, and it's almost like they're one being, almost, like, is the way that it's often portrayed, which does kind of make me think of that kind of post-human evolutionary thing that is definitely a Stapleton obsession, right? Like, he wants to explore that, and he does it, like, to the utmost in his cosmic books, but it's still kind of here.
The entity of Sirius Plaxy, the two names combined.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's also a thing that becomes an obsession of a lot of science fiction in the future, is this idea of merging two beings into one, kind of one in some way or another. Maybe more than two beings even. But, like, this idea of creating some kind of gestalt organism is really big with, like, Theodore Sturgeon moving forward into the 40s and beyond, and so many other writers. But yeah, that's a really interesting and ahead of its time, I think, in a lot of ways, in certain ways that are still sort of disquieting, I guess, from ethical and other standpoints. There are so many good scenes in this. Like, I mean, we were talking about the Jeffrey, the Reverend stuff, and I really like that. And I think he was, like, almost the second father that Sirius needed, although in the end didn't really seem to help him overall, although he said it was worthwhile. That was his last word. It was worthwhile. But before that, there's the other scene in the other church that he walks into, and he's, like, not welcome there, right? And the priest is like getting all puffy chested and being like, "Ha! Who let the dog in? Get that thing out of here!" And then Sirius like starts singing the hymn, and he's like mocking them, and like they try to grab him, and Sirius is so like immune to being grabbed, right? And it's just, I love that part. That was one of my favorite parts of the books. That made me cheer. I was right there with you, Sirius. I love that part. And it was a moment. And I love the way he describes the priest when he's like making his sermon, and Sirius is like, at first he's in the shadows, just kind of listening to the sermon. Yeah. And he says, the priest had a tone that was unctuously complacent and servile. Stapledon was not really, I mean, we talked already about how he was influenced by H.G. Wells, and although he doesn't mention reading The Island of Dr. Moreau, there's obviously a certain similarity with Moreau trying to uplift these, quote, beast creatures, right? Except he didn't bring them up right at all. Yeah. He was kind of more like another mad scientist figure that we'll be coming to later on in the podcast. But Stapledon seems like he's maybe a bit less of a materialist than H.G. Wells is. And it seems like they got into some arguments about that. And it's weird because Stapledon seems not exactly religious, but it's kind of a cliche nowadays, I guess, but more spiritual. And I just thought it was kind of interesting. One of the things that I read had said that like he corresponded with H.G. Wells for over a decade. And at one point he drew this cartoon or something, and he's like, I'm the blackbird, and he's like wandering back and forth between these two cages, and in one cage is like the hardcore atheists, and in the other one is like the religious people and stuff like that. And he's like he's comparing himself to a jackdaw or something like that, and just kind of like flying between the two. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know that he was necessarily in conflict, like maybe he was quite calm about it all, but he just seems kind of similar to Wells in a lot of ways, but also different, like also maybe a little less. I mean, they're both quite willing to make their views known in their fiction, but it seems like Stapledon might be a little bit less certain of himself. And from my background reading, this book is compared a lot with Oddjohn, which I haven't read.
Yeah, this is the only Stapledon I've read so far.
Yeah.
So Oddjohn is about a person who's like super intelligent, and how isolating he is for that reason. And it seems like he goes through a lot of the same things that Sirius does, and in the end he does find a community, but it sounds pretty bleak. It sounds kind of, this one is too, but it feels almost like Sirius is him kind of answering some of his previous things, because maybe he was a little bit unsettled by this idea that like, oh, this person is so much superior to everyone else, and he's so much like, he's like the Superman, which again became a big obsession of science fiction, especially starting in the early 40s. Yeah. You know, like especially American SF and comic books and stuff like that. Like, you know, the Superman is so, yeah, like obviously the idea sort of stems from Nietzsche and the Übermensch kind of idea, which...
Yeah, I mean, his name is directly Superman, you know? You can't get more clear than that.
And I don't think he meant that literally, but like, I mean, maybe he did in a sense, in a mental and physical sense, but like a lot of people sort of read into that a little extra and had like, well, you know, we can give this individual powers that make him or her somehow have an advantage over the masses of humanity. And what would happen? Like, how would they be? And, well, there's probably more than one. They probably have to meet up and form a society of super beings, right? And that's what you see a lot. And it's kind of interesting. One of the papers that I read sort of speculated that it was World War II and the things leading up to it that made Stapledon kind of think, well, maybe this isn't the right way to handle this kind of thing, right? Like, I have to tackle this story with a slightly different approach. And I think maybe that's kind of how we got Sirius.
Certainly the bombing of London seemed to affect him quite a bit.
Yeah. Most people, I would say, who listen to this podcast and who are interested in vintage science fiction probably would get something from this, and
I would
should read this. I really like the musical touches as well. Like, I kind of, was trying to picture that in my head. And I think he even mentions a couple of artists at one point that Sirius is kind of like slightly interested in, despite the fact that it's obnoxious human music.
Yeah.
Vaughn Williams comes up, which is kind of cool. She's like classic blues singer, right? There's so many interesting layers and touches to this, and it was just so cool. Despite we have a couple of misgivings about the way certain things are handled, mostly just one in my case. I think that the whole idea of the sexual relationship, like, it's thorny, like it you have to think about how you want to address it in your head. I think that the fact that Sirius is different makes me feel differently about it. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I still wasn't into it, but
that's okay. Yeah. I get it. You don't have to be a fan of it. I'm not. By the way, this book was censored.
Oh, I can totally believe that. Yeah.
By the publisher.
Yeah.
I don't know quite how much, but apparently Stapledon was not pleased. Not pleased with it. So, but we don't have the original manuscript, so we don't know exactly what was censored. And by we, I mean, like, there is no, I guess the original manuscript didn't survive.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what will surface one day. Stranger things have happened.
Yeah. But it does kind of make you wonder, what did the publisher decide was too obscene? And that was the reason that it was censored. It was like, the publisher thought there was some obscenity. The way that I read about it suggested that it was nothing like empirical. It was more, like a few words here and there.
Yeah, I feel like it probably had something to do with, like, even in the work, it kind of tiptoes around, like, what exactly the relationship with Sirius and Plaxi is. And even, I feel like it might have something, this might have actually been, like, a change that he made or was forced to make. There's that one part where Robert, when he first shows up to Sirius and Plaxi's cottage, and he says something like, I won't describe in detail what Plaxi told me because it's like her personal business. Right. I feel like maybe that had replaced something that the editors said, he had to take out.
Definitely could have.
Yeah, it was probably, exactly. It was probably something around those particular things. So I just realized, too, another example of the let's make a single being out of two individuals is one that we did last time.
Right.
The Soul Giver.
Yeah.
And I feel like it'll come up also a bit later in this episode.
I think so.
Yeah.
With a very particular work we'll be talking about has a similar type of premise.
Yeah, there's an interesting lot, which I wasn't expecting from these stories. I mean, I expected severed heads from all of them and brains and that kind of thing. But the amount of dogs that play into the later stories, I wasn't expect coming up. And, we'll get to that later. But, yeah, they're there, too. But, yeah, I enjoyed this one overall. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's very rare that something is. So I think I can recommend this overall with the slight misgivings that I have in certain parts of it.
Yeah, I agree that overall I think this is a really good work. And I think there's a lot of layers that are really interesting to discuss and to think about. It's definitely, I don't regret reading it at all, and I would enjoy reading some more by Stapledon.
Oh, absolutely. I'm definitely interested to read Last and First Man and Star Maker especially.
Yeah, and we will be getting to those. Don't know when, maybe next year?
Yeah, sometime. So they'll be there waiting for us.
Yeah, I don't know. I liked it a lot. I can forgive his mistake towards the end, and the fact that the last part of the book is maybe not quite as pleasing as what came before. At least it's kind of confined to the last quarter of the book, and then the very end, the end is very effective. So I'm not going to complain about that. Obviously, it will make you sad, so be ready for that. The dog dies.
That's it's a lot. There's a lot of media that's like that. It kind of falls into that sort of genre of get ready for the dog to die.
Yeah.
Yeah,
very
unfortunately,
popular.
dogs don't have a good mortality rate in these genre stories.
Depends on the story, but
I think though that usually dogs in fiction do have a dignified ending where usually cats, when they die, is like a joke or something that's not very serious. You're just kind of like, oh, well, that happened.
Yeah, but I think you can sort of imagine a version of this story that did turn out well, and I think that this is kind of something that might be central to Stapledon. Again, is a feeling or a conviction that he has that, yeah, community is important to human beings, and it's through our interactions with other human beings that we stabilize ourselves and that are able to cooperate with each other and live a satisfying life. And so from the outsider's perspective, we can see that, and we can see what the community is like. And there is a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of things that are not that pleasant to behold. And it's the life for the outsider is going to be sort of tragic like that. And I think that he wants us to feel sort of uplifted in a way in Sirius's presence. Even though Sirius is not a perfect being, the fact that he is an isolated spiritual being is important. And he wants us to kind of feel a little bit of awe, I think, when we think about it. And it's a really interesting thing because we've had quite a few instances of scientists creating life on the podcast. And a lot of the time it's treated a little differently than here. I think this is, even though it doesn't end well, and even though, yes, Sirius, he kills maybe somewhat gratuitously at times, and he's a little bit unsettling, especially when he goes into the wolf mood and stuff like that. This is overall more positive about it. And I think that this is something we're going to see a lot more in the future, is this kind of, in a way, embracing of the very frightening but very awe-inspiring possibilities that come with scientific development and advancement.
Yeah, definitely an interesting take on the Frankenstein story that you really don't see in a lot of the other works that we've covered along those lines.
All right. Well, if nobody has anything else to add on the great Alsatian, I think we'll move on at this point to a great brain, a great stylish brain